Welcome to Sheriff's Talk, brought to you by the Missouri Sheriff's Association. During this episode and ones that follow, we'll be talking with sheriffs from across the state regarding topics relating to county law enforcement and jails. So please stay tuned. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsor.
The Missouri Sheriff's Association, or MSA, was established in 1945 with the goal to support the sheriffs of Missouri and their staff by offering law enforcement training, legislative support, and technical support. MSA offers memberships, agency contracts, and vendor partnerships, and each comes with their own variety of perks like full access to the learning management system and support, tax-deductible contributions, membership card, vehicle decals, sheriff and jail magazine subscriptions, advertisement opportunities, reduced training prices, access to webinars, podcasts, and training, and CCW support. Join the Missouri Sheriff's Association and proudly display your support for your local law enforcement and Missouri sheriffs. Your tax-deductible contributions will go a long way to ensure the Office of Sheriff in Missouri remains strong, independent office, answerable to those citizens that it is sworn to serve and protect. Your support is what makes the Missouri Sheriff's Association great, so visit mosheriffs.com and become a member today.
Welcome to the show. My name's Sam Boyd. I'm here with Sheriff Lewis from St. Charles County. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Good. Tell me a little bit about St. Charles County, like the size of your population, that kind of stuff.
St. Charles County, so we are on the east side of the state next to St. Louis County. We're the third largest county in the state, 420,000 or so folks on the confluence of the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers.
How many sworn officers do you have?
Our department works primarily with the courts. So we have about 40 commissioned deputies, and then we have court security marshals. We have 10 of those, and they provide security for our courts. We had about 60 total employees.
Sheriff Hewitt just talked about court security last week. That was a pretty good conversation. So you're wanting to talk about the history of the sheriff as it pertains to a little bit of the history of the position of the sheriff in total, as well as the history of the sheriff of St. Charles County.
Yeah, my administrative assistant, she sits just outside of my office, and probably, at least 5 times a day, I'll hear her try to explain to the people that call in what our duties are and what our responsibilities are. And it amazes me that St. Charles County's been around the sheriff's office has been around for so long, but still, it's amazing that the citizens don't know exactly what we do.
Yeah, I was looking through some of your material before the show, and it goes back. There's some history there. I won't say too much, but you're getting ready to do that. But
yeah.
Wow, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting. The office of the sheriff is an interesting position in itself, being the only elected law enforcement agency. So it has a lot of history, and a lot of people think of the Wild West days, the sheriffs. So
yeah, when you hear the word sheriff, that's what I think of mostly before I worked for a sheriff department. When I heard sheriff, that's my mind immediately went to the old-timey West with the sheriffs and the guns and the horses and the saloons and all that stuff.
Yeah, and in Missouri in particular, because the state is so diverse. So you have the major urban areas, St. Louis, Kansas City, Springfield, Columbia, and then we have a lot of rural areas too.
A lot of rural areas
in the state. So the office of sheriff in St. Charles County, for example, is so much different than it is in another county. Yeah.
All right, let us hear what you got to say.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the office of the sheriff. Goes way back to England, and the 808, the shire or the county was a geographic area in England, and they had a reeve who was like the leader, and the kings would appoint the shire reeve to enforce the king's orders, the court's orders, and then also collect taxes. And here's an example of the sheriff of Yorkshire, which is the reeve of the county. In St. Charles County, I'm the 51st sheriff, and we've had in the 1800s, there was a lot more sheriffs than there were in the 1900s. That's because they initially were term limited. Going back in history, the sheriffs in this part of the country start after the Louisiana Purchase. So Thomas Jefferson, he sent the representatives over to England or to France to negotiate with Napoleon. He wanted control of the Mississippi River. So he wanted New Orleans, and he was shocked when they came back and Napoleon was willing to sell the entire Louisiana Purchase. And they weren't exactly sure what to do with the rest of the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson just lopped off the New Orleans portion of it and then turned the rest of it over temporarily to the territorial governor of the Indiana Territory. And what he did was divided the upper Louisiana into 5 different districts. And that's when the different sheriff's offices were created. He wanted to mimic the U.S. way of having a separation of powers where they had the court and the judge were different offices. And during the French and Spanish control of the Louisiana Purchase, it was done by a commandant, which was both the law enforcement but also the judge. It was a military type position, almost like a provost marshal. So William Henry Harrison, as I mentioned, he was the territorial governor of Indiana. So he divided the upper Louisiana into 5 different districts: St. Charles, St. Louis, St. Genevieve, Cape Girardeau, New Madrid. And this map I've got shows those different districts. The boundaries of St. Charles district was all the territory west of the Mississippi River and north of the Missouri River, which included the states of Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana. And then St. Louis County was the territory south of the Missouri River. And then these two skinny counties, that was Cape Girardeau and St. Genevieve.
The long ones.
The long, skinny ones. And those were like Missouri, Kansas, Colorado. And then the large one on the south was New Madrid County, which was the southern half of Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, the northern part of Texas. So some of these districts were ginormous. So could you imagine today people complain about response time? Could you imagine what the complaint was like?
That'd be a long way to go on a horse or
on a
wagon.
Horse. As the territories developed, they started separating and making the different counties within the sheriffs, but these were the original 5, and that was in 1805 when the United States took possession. Now remember, 1804, Lewis and Clark took off up the Missouri River to explore. So again, they still weren't sure what they were doing with the territory. In 1805, when they put this under temporary control of Governor Harrison, he appointed those 5 sheriffs and the different courts for those different districts. And our first sheriff appointed in St. Charles was Mackey Wary. And the sheriffs in those days had, similar to the English sheriffs, they had what we call the 3 traditional duties: keepers of the court, keepers of the jail, and keepers of the peace. And our first courthouse in St. Charles County was built in 1849. And this is one of our jails that was built in 1911. So prior to that, so from 1805 till 1849, it's the sheriff's responsibility to provide a facility for the court. Well, that was really one of their biggest. If you look at those early court cases in the early 1800s, there was an occasional assault, stealing, those types of things, theft, horse theft, cattle theft, that type of thing. But the majority of the cases were civil cases. It was this person owed me money, this
Killed my pig or killed my horse, cases like that.
Yeah, there was the early territorial legislature. They passed a fence law, and it's not like how it is today, where you build a fence to keep your cattle and your property. It was the opposite. You build a fence to keep the cattle out of your property. If your neighbor cattle trampled your crops or whatever, or destroyed, caused some sort of property damage, the court would send the sheriff and what they called commissioners out to inspect your fence and to make sure your fence was built strong enough to keep your neighbors.
I'm sure in rural Missouri, there's probably still some of those cases that happen where cattle get out and get hit by a car or tear up a fence. And I know there was something with a large pig got in the road and somebody hit it and they hit it with their car. So they're claiming car damage
right
on the farm owner or the animal owner.
Sure.
Yeah.
And that was the majority of the cases. So the sheriff was responsible basically to provide all of the necessary things for the court in order for them to have court. There's one story, which is now part of Lincoln County, Old Monroe. So the sheriff had set up in a home. Some of these, a lot of times the sheriff would rent a school or a church or some public building to have court. And some of these communities, they would actually have it in a home. And in this one example, when the sheriff showed up, he had already subpoenaed everybody. The judge and the jurors and the attorneys were all coming. And when he got there, the family that lived there, the lady was in labor. And he pled with the sheriff. He said, my wife is in labor. We're about to have a baby here. We can't have all these people in our home. So when the judge got there, he explained to the judge what the circumstances were. And he's, look, Sheriff, we've got all these people you've already.
And they've all traveled there somewhere on a horse or wagon or something to get there,
Exactly.
which would take us 15 minutes today, but they had to go through who knows what to get to that location. Yeah.
So he says, we got to go. We got to move forward with this. So, they took out the couches and the furniture in the living room and brought in chairs and set it up like a courtroom. And in the bedroom of the home, the lady successfully delivered a baby boy, and while court was going on.
On the topic, but a little different. I'm watching an old Western or something, and sometimes they just set up the courtroom right inside the local speakeasy.
Yeah.
And moved all the tables and chairs out of the way. I'm sure that was accurate of the way that went down.
Yep. They would basically any building that was available in that different community. Another interesting thing when I was talking about the counties earlier. So today we have 114 counties and there's 115 sheriffs. Somebody's going to say, wait a minute, how do you have 115 sheriffs when there's only 114 counties? We'll come back to that. But Missouri has a lot of counties. And the reason why they made so many initially was because the judges and the courts, they traveled a circuit. So they wanted one county seat to the next county seat to only be a day's horse ride. If you look at a map of some of these other, particularly the big western states, Montana and the Dakotas and those places, the counties are ginormous, huge. There's some states that are smaller than
a judge gets in a wagon after court and goes to the next county, and then he's not coming back around to your county until days, months later, because he's got to go to all these different places to get back to you to do the court proceeding.
That's right. Yeah, they traveled the circuit. The three traditional duties, the keeper of the court, as I mentioned, the sheriff was really responsible for enforcing the court orders, serving all the subpoenas and those types of things. And then in the early days, the keeper of the jail, there wasn't a whole lot to it in the early days. I know the first jail in St. Charles County was just a one room, one cell stone building that had two buckets in it, the freshwater bucket and the waste bucket. And you would get visited by the sheriff or one of his deputies probably maybe once a day.
Yeah, the Andy Griffith jail is probably luxurious compared to some of these other
the early jails. So there wasn't a whole lot to that job either. And like I said earlier, a lot of the court cases back in those early 1800s, there wasn't a whole lot of criminal cases where people were actually sentenced to jail. Most of it was debts and those types of things where the person had to pay a fine. Other early duties of the sheriff was to administer corporal punishment. A lot of people don't know we used to have corporal punishment back if you're my age and you can remember in school, they used to still SWAT kids back in those days. That's totally crazy talk nowadays, but
I need it. But
and in St. Charles County, at least, we didn't have the old pillory, where you stick your head in your arms that you've seen in some of the old westerns. We didn't have that, but they did have a whipping post. It was in the front yard of the jail, which was located in those days right behind the courthouse that I showed earlier. And so if you were sentenced to pillory, the sheriff would just tie you up to the post and leave you out there for so many days. They also actually used to whip. So the judge would order the sheriff to give you so many lashes for whatever the offense was. And then, of course, for capital crimes, the sheriffs were responsible for capital punishment in those days. And the sheriff would actually hire a contractor and they would erect a gallows out in the yard of the county jail, or maybe in some places in the town square. And they were open to the public, and the sheriff would be the guy that actually had to pull the lever to execute a person for capital punishment.
It's amazing where we came from to where we're at now. I'm not saying good or bad. It's just, it's amazing to hear the history and go back and be able to picture the way it was to the way it is now. It's, yeah.
That's why I said I really enjoy it, and I wish I had more time to study it. As I get time every now and then, I have a subscription to read old newspapers, so I'll read some of these articles about stories like this when they actually did the capital punishment, and they would test the rope and all the things that they used to have to think about, that things that we don't even consider today.
How long have you been sheriff?
So I've been the sheriff for 9 years. I'm just was reelected to my third term last year. I'm an odd duck, and we could talk about that again in a few minutes when we talk about charter counties. So I should say all, there's one other exception. Most of the sheriffs in the state are elected at the same time as the president and the governor. When we became a charter form of government, all of our elections for our county officials was shortened to a 2-year term, and then the new charter officers started, and that put us in the midterm cycle. So I'm the only sheriff in the state that's elected in a midterm cycle, and then we have one sheriff who's appointed. And we could talk about him in just a second.
Bringing up that, what got you interested in the history of so much of the sheriff? Was it when you took office? Was it way before that? Or I'm the sheriff now, I need to find out what my office is about and the history of it?
It was when right after I got elected, when I first took office, the county had actually started a history book, and the communications director, she gave me a draft of it and said, "Hey, can you read this and let us know what your thoughts are about it?" And that really it piqued my interest, and the book was published. And then as I was doing more research, I found that there was 2 sheriffs that they completely missed. We're going to have to come back with a second edition of that book. And then the Sheriff's Association also, right before I came into office, they were doing a history book as well.
Yeah, I think I've seen that book.
It's got all the different counties in it. And again, that's when we start talking about some of these other counties, there was some missed details that hopefully will get corrected.
All right.
So other duties of the sheriff, again, going back to that medieval England, the sheriff was also responsible to protect the shire. So he would call upon the citizens, and he would form a militia or form a posse. And then those old sheriffs used to collect taxes. And then in the early duties of the sheriffs in Missouri, collecting taxes was also one of their responsibilities. Thank goodness we've gotten rid of that job.
All right. Before we keep going, Sheriff,
Sure.
Let's go ahead and take a break real quick for our sponsors. We'll be back in just a minute.
Join the Missouri Sheriff's Association in its efforts to ensure the office of the sheriff in Missouri remains a strong, independent office, answerable to those citizens it is sworn to serve and protect. Your support is what helps make the Missouri Sheriff's Association great. Visit mosheriffs.com to learn more.
So today, as I mentioned, there's 115 sheriffs in the state. So we went from those original 5 to 115. And it's interesting how we got to that 115. I mentioned that when we were forming the counties, that they didn't want the next county seat to be more than a day's horse ride away. That's why we have as many counties as we do. You may have heard somebody said, how did we end up with 115 sheriffs when we only have 114 counties? It's the Great Divorce of St. Louis from 1876. What happened was the city of St. Louis at the time, I think, was like the 4th largest city in the country. And they were mad at the county commissioners. They didn't call them commissioners, they called them county court then. But they were mad at the county because they were sending so much of the tax dollars out into the rural parts of the county, building roads and those type of things. So there was always a conflict between the city and the county. And they were able to get something inserted in the 1875 Constitution, state constitution, where there was a vote, and they voted to separate, so the city was no longer part of St. Louis County. So they had to create a new county seat, which they moved it to Clayton. And then the city had to create all of the county offices, because once the sheriff and the jail and the collector and the assessor and all those county responsibilities moved to Clayton, now the city had to have its own. So that's when they created the St. Louis City Sheriff's Office in 1876. And then the next, what I would call a big change in the sheriff's office, was in the 1945 Constitution. In the state constitution of 1945, there was two things that happened, more than two really, that involved the sheriff. They went away from the fee system and went to a salary for the sheriff. Up until that point, so from 1805 till that 1945 Constitution was passed, the sheriff operated off of a fee. So for every paper they served, they received a fee. For every prisoner that they housed, the county would pay the sheriff a fee, and then he was responsible to pay his office and all of his expenses from those fees. In that Constitution, they got rid of that, where they still collect the fees on papers, for example, or when they do an execution or say sheriff sale, the sheriff collects a fee off of that, but now it goes into the county treasury instead of to the sheriff to operate his office. They also got rid of the term limits in the 1945 Constitution. If I could scroll back to the numbers of sheriffs we had, you notice in the 1800s, there seems to be a lot more than in the 1900s and 2000s. That's because of that 1945 Constitution that was passed that eliminated the term limits. Prior to that, the original Constitution in 1821, the term of office was for 2 years for a maximum of 2 terms. So you could serve 4 years in any 8-year period. The 1875 Constitution changed it to a 4-year term, but you're still term limited to those 4 years in any 8-year period. In 1945, Les Blackmeyer, when he was elected sheriff in 1945, he became the longest serving sheriff in St. Charles County. He served 24 years. And Sheriff Blackmeyer was one of the original founders of the Missouri Sheriff's Association. Okay. That's when they came together the sheriffs came together and created the organization to make the office more professional. The other provision I think was significant in the 1945 Constitution, they put in a provision that a first-class county could pass a county charter. And what that is basically, it's almost like a constitution for the county. And that they could determine, instead of the state legislature, at the local level, they could determine what the responsibilities and the duties of the offices within their county. And that created, St. Louis County became a charter form of government in the 1950s. And in 1955, the St. Louis County Police was established, which was the first one in the state. And the county police was responsible for that peacekeeper or that law enforcement duty. And then the sheriff's duties switched to dealing with the courts and the jail. And then both in the city of St. Louis and St. Charles County in the 60s, they both changed again and created the Department of Corrections in both the city and the county. In St. Charles County, we became a charter form of government in 1993, and the St. Charles County Department of Corrections, so that jail function, was transferred to the St. Charles County Department of Corrections. And that's an appointed position. The leader, the director of the jail, reports to the county executive. And so we went from that one cell back in 1805 to today. I think our facility holds a little over 500, I think 520 prisoners.
Do you as a sheriff have anything to do with the jail as far as the St. Charles County Jail?
I don't have any of the operational duties of the jail. Now, we do all of the prisoner transporting.
Okay.
If it's something other than a medical appointment or something like that, once they leave the facility, it's our responsibility to transport them either after they're convicted to the state prisons, or if it's pre-trial, or if the warrant's been issued and they're in a hospital, for example, then our deputies are responsible to sit on them at the hospital. If they're already in the jail's custody, then they're responsible for it.
Okay.
So the next big change occurred in 2015, and St. Charles County became the second county police department in the state. So again, they're responsible for the law enforcement functions in the county. They respond to the calls for service. They do the investigations of the crimes and that sort of thing. And then the sheriff is still responsible for everything associated with the court. And our operations are broke down into 3 basic work groups: our court services unit, our civil process unit, and our field services unit. Our court services are just like all the other counties in the state, provide the bailiffs in the courtrooms. We also provide, I mentioned earlier, we have court security marshals who provide the security. What I would relate them to, and when I do the presentation in the public, it's kind of like when you go to the airport, TSA, you have to go through the x-ray machine, the metal detector, that sort of thing. Our court security marshals are responsible for the physical security of the 3 different courts that we're responsible for. We also have a bomb dog. His name's Max. He, like I said, does explosives, materials, and interestingly, he gets called out quite a bit. The major case squad will call him. He's really good at when there's a shooting and the casings get ejected out of the weapon. Sometimes those are difficult to find if it's particularly.
Sniffs 'em out.
Yeah, he sniffs them right out and finds them. So he's been a big asset. And then we've used him on numerous events, big concerts in St. Louis. He'll come out and assist the St. Louis City or St. Louis County Police in doing a search of the venues when they have big concerts and those type of things. Our civil process unit, probably similar to every county in the state, is the backbone of the court side. These ladies and gentlemen, they work directly with the courts and the attorneys and get all that paperwork, and there's a lot of it. Get it out.
Well, you got to make sure that stuff's right too, because that's one of the things that can get the sheriff in big trouble is not doing the civil process properly.
I'm on my 35th year in law enforcement, and I was never sued. Yeah, never sued until I became the sheriff, and then it seems like it's a regular occurrence.
You better not call it again.
Yeah, because it's like you said, you got to have that paperwork right, and if you don't do something correctly, there's always an opportunity to take you to court and make you correct it.
Yep.
So they have a big responsibility, and like I said, they get that paperwork from the court and get it out to the deputies to get them and meet. This lists all the different types of notices and documents and things that we serve from the courts. Our field services unit, they're the visible side. We have 17 deputies assigned to that, and they do all kinds of things. So that they're post-licensed officers, just like any other agency. But like I said before, the law enforcement duties have been transferred to the county police, but they can do any law enforcement duty that's comes up during the course of their activity. So if they're driving down the highway, and they can enforce traffic laws just like the police do, but they're primarily out doing enforcement of the court's activities. Court orders of protection, for example, they're serving people, and a lot of those orders of protection, the aggressor has to be removed from the residence. So they do that. They also do the mental health and commitment orders. So when the judge orders that somebody gets taken into custody and taken to a mental health facility, they have to do those types of things.
Evictions.
Yeah. They also do all of the civil warrants, body attachments. If there's a judgment and the person doesn't pay that judgment, an attorney can go to court. And just like a criminal arrest warrant, they can have a person arrested and put in jail, and then that bond that they post to get out of jail then goes towards paying off their judgment against them.
I've seen most of my experience with those were witnesses not showing up and the judge sending out, hey, you need to come and testify,
Yeah.
and then basically sit in jail until they do testify up to a certain extent.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, they do those things. I talked about earlier the sheriff's sales. That's another, when I came to this job, I thought was interesting that we had a situation where a person was sending his child to a private school and wasn't paying the tuition. So the school knew that he had a classic car, and they filed a judgment. And so we had to go pick up his classic car and then literally, like you hear in the old days, sell it on the courthouse steps. So we had to tow the car, and we had an auction right there and sold that car, and the proceeds from the sale went to pay off that judgment.
Yep.
And then our field services is also responsible for, like I mentioned, all of the prisoner transport. So we back and forth between the jail and the courthouse. If one of the municipal police departments, for example, stops you and you have a warrant, they'll take you back to their facility, and then they call us and we come get you and bring you back to the jail. And then we do a lot of out-of-state fugitive extraditions that, again, people don't realize. So if you have a felony warrant from St. Charles County and you get stopped by the Miami, Florida Police Department, and they run that through the computer system and it comes back you have an active warrant, then we have to send 2 of our deputies to Miami to pick you up and bring you back.
Well, you probably want to go on the Hawaii one. When you got somebody
Yeah.
in Hawaii, you got to go, I'll go on that trip. You can get volunteers to go to that one.
Yeah, we had one in Puerto Rico,
Yeah.
and I volunteered to go on that one, but it ended up they let them post bond, so I didn't get to go on that one. But I've been to New York City. Now, this is me personally. The deputies in the field services unit, they've, I think, been to every state, but I've been to Key West, Florida, New York City, as I mentioned.
Let's tie this into the history a little bit. Did they do that same thing back in the day? Did the sheriff on the horse go from Missouri to out to Wyoming and pick up his prisoner and horse him all the way back to?
They did. They sure did. Yep. There's all kinds of examples, particularly when the trains were around, where the sheriff would hop on a train and go to Kansas City and pick up a prisoner that was arrested in Jackson County and would ride him on the train back to St. Charles.
Yeah, that's interesting to try and picture that in your head of what we do now, that they did the exact same thing back then, just with less resources.
Have you seen the TV show on Bass Reeves? About Bass Reeves? I think it's on Paramount. It's about the marshal from the Oklahoma territory, and that was back during the early 1800s when it's that old sheriff, old U.S. Marshal thing where he's out transporting prisoners, and he brings them back to the court, and he goes up to the clerk with his executed arrest warrant, and she pays him right there on the spot for bringing the prisoner back. It's an interesting time. And the sheriff's department's still really involved. We work closely with our partners at the county police department, for example. One of the big things they do every year is Shop with a Cop and a Deputy program. The county police and the county sheriff's office, we get together, raise funds, and then each December we bring in some of the needy families in the community, and it's a great opportunity to interact with each other and with the folks in the community. And we're actually doing a trunk or treat at the county police department. So we still work real closely together. I always put this when I do this presentation to the community groups. Again, a lot of folks just aren't aware of the history of the office, but we've actually had 3 of our members that have been lost in a line of duty. And considering that St. Charles County is so large, it's amazing that we've only had 3. And the first was Sheriff Durker, who was killed in 1916. This was resulted from a dispute. A farmer and one of his farmhands were having a dispute over wages. The farmhand burst through the front door while the farmer and his family were sitting down having dinner, and he had a shotgun and fired basically at the entire group. Sitting
Blasted.
And nobody got hurt, but he didn't know that. He just burst through the front door and fired a shotgun at him. So he ran to a nearby barn and hid out. And Sheriff Durker, when he showed up, he knew who the farmhand was and thought that he could negotiate with them to surrender because Sheriff Durker knew this, that nobody was hurt, but unfortunately the bad guy didn't. And when Sheriff Durker came up to the barn door, this guy shot Sheriff Durker in the stomach. And then one of his deputies ran up to assist him. And then that deputy was also shot, but wasn't killed. So when all the deputies came running to the aid, the guy escaped and went to another barn. This all happened in the Boshertown area of St. Charles County. And by this time, the word had spread to the community. The sheriff from St. Louis County came over. The former sheriff, who Sheriff Durker actually beat in the previous election, he came out. This young man was doing his chores the next morning, and up in the hayloft of the barn, he heard this rustling. So he ran back in the house and told his parents that there's somebody in the barn. And they were aware that there was people out looking for this guy. And by the time the word spread, the barn was surrounded by the town folks. And so he tried to surrender, and they weren't having any part of it.
Didn't have it.
So they fired shots at him, and he retreated back into the barn. We ended up catching the barn on fire, thinking that in the fire he'd be able to escape. And he again tried to, as the barn's burning now, tried to surrender again, and they weren't having any part of it, so they shot at him again, and he ended up dying in the fire. Lieutenant Musterman, he was killed in 1969. He made a traffic stop on Interstate 64 near the Daniel Boone Bridge. What he didn't know is the guy he had stopped was a contract killer. He had just murdered a gentleman who was going to be a witness in a federal drug case in Wentzville. And unbeknownst to him, he pulled him over for a traffic violation, and the guy jumped out of the vehicle and shot and killed him before he even had a chance to get out of the car. And then Deputy Richard Hinkey was killed almost in the identical area a few years later in 1971. There was a burglary in Weldon Spring, and the sheriff ordered a roadblock, thinking that they were going to go back into St. Louis County. And so as they had cars stopped and were checking for these bad guys, a drunk driver ran through the roadblock and struck and killed Deputy Hinkey. And the Highway Patrol had another roadblock just further down the road, and they were able to get the guy stopped. And Deputy Hinkey's holster that was ripped off his gun belt was actually still on the windshield of the car. Wow. When the guy got stopped by the Highway Patrol. That's where we're at today. That's the history of the St. Charles County and the Office of Sheriff. There are two other charter counties in the state, Jefferson and Jackson County. Now, Jefferson County is still like the other 112 counties in the state. They still are responsible, even though they're a charter form of government. The sheriff there is still responsible for the law enforcement duties, the courts, and the jail. Jackson County is a little interesting because they took the jail away and created the Department of Corrections, I think back in the 60s as well. The same time the city and St. Louis City and St. Louis County did. But recently, the voters in Jackson County gave that responsibility back to the sheriff. So they still have a Department of Corrections, but instead of the director reporting to the county executive, the director reports to the sheriff. He still has those three traditional sheriff duties today.
It's very interesting to hear this history because as much as things have changed for the sheriff and technology and all that, it's interesting to see that it hasn't changed a whole lot from what you used to do or what the sheriff used to do to what they do today. It really hasn't changed that much. A few duties here, a few duties there, but you're still doing what the sheriffs did back in the 1800s.
Exactly. But if you want to get really crazy deep into the history, it's the part of the sheriff being elected is also interesting. Initially, back in England, the Shire Reeve was elected by the people of his community, and the king saw how influential they were in their counties, in their shire. That's when the king took it the Shire Reeves brought them into being responsible for enforcing his laws and his orders and collecting taxes and those sort of things. When they became appointed, there was some kind of tyrannical type kings for a while, and the sheriffs became that way. So then when they wrote the Magna Carta in, I think, 1270 something or other, out of the 60 provisions in the Magna Carta, like 25 of them related to the sheriff and what their duties were. And it changed it from being an appointed position from the king back to being an elected from the community.
I can see how that could be appointed positions could be back in that time, favoritism, and this guy's going to do what I want him to do. So I'm going to appoint him to be in this position. See those being issues.
Right. Because your boss is whoever appointed you.
Right.
You know, either the mayor or the board of aldermen or whatever the case may be. And in this office, you're responsible to the people.
Right. Sheriff, thanks for coming in today.
Thank you.
And
Enjoyed it.
It was very interesting to hear the history of not only the sheriff, but the history of St. Charles County. Is there anything else you'd like to say or add to tell your people back at home?
I just want to say that support your local sheriff. The Missouri Sheriff's Association has honorary memberships, and that those memberships help support the office of sheriff around the state. The Sheriff's Association does a great job providing training twice a year. All the sheriffs from around the state, we get together and enjoy each other's companies and talk about what's going on, but also get some valuable training.
Sheriff hours.
That's right. We get the required number of continuing education hours, and there's always an opportunity for the citizens and business owners in our state to support the sheriffs of the state.
All right. Sheriff, thank you again for coming in.
Thank you, sir. Enjoyed it.
And, we'll end this show with that. So thanks for watching Sheriff's Talk. You can find us on YouTube. Look up the MissouriSheriffs.com, Vimo, any links that individuals send you. You can find us on there or just look us up. Thank you very much for watching the show. This is the host of Sheriff's Talk, Sam Boyd. We hope you enjoyed the show. If you would like to find out more about MSA or become a member, go to mosheriffs.com and click Become a Member. Hope to hear from you soon.